The gentle ocean breeze of the Pacific brushed against the vast illuminated terraces of a magnificent estate in Santa Barbara, California, as twilight descended over the wealthy coastal enclave. That evening marked the grand celebration of the 30th anniversary of Osborne Holdings, one of the most influential and prestigious construction firms in the United States of America. Prominent entrepreneurs, local politicians, renowned architects, and eager journalists wandered through the perfectly manicured gardens holding elegant flutes of expensive champagne. Everyone present was absolutely convinced they were attending the most significant and lucrative corporate social event of the spring season. Among the glittering sea of influential guests arrived a remarkably unassuming young woman named Ivy. She wore a tasteful but incredibly simple navy blue dress, completely devoid of flashy jewelry, with her dark hair casually pinned back in a natural, effortless style. She had driven herself to the spectacular mansion in the exact same reliable older compact car she had utilized for over 5 years, a vehicle that stood in stark contrast to the luxurious imported sports cars and stretched limousines crowding the sprawling gravel driveway. With a warm, genuine smile, she greeted the busy reception staff at the grand entrance, speaking to them with a familiar kindness, as if she had known this opulent place and its workers for her entire life. While the majority of the wealthy invitees barely registered the existence of the catering staff, a heavy silver tray full of crystal glasses suddenly began to slip from the trembling hands of a young, overwhelmed waiter named William. Ivy reacted with lightning speed, reaching out to firmly catch the tilting edge of the heavy tray before a single piece of delicate crystal could shatter against the marble floor. She looked at the panicked young man, offered him a reassuring smile, and whispered that he was still perfectly in time to save the evening and that everything was going to be all right. The grateful boy let out a massive breath of relief, profusely thanking her and calling her ma'am, to which she gently insisted he just call her by her first name. Just a few steps further down the grand hallway, Ivy warmly greeted the tired coat check attendant, an older woman named Betty, remembering to ask specifically about how her husband was recovering following his recent and complicated hip surgery. The weary woman smiled with deep, genuine emotion, profoundly touched, because among the hundreds of incredibly important and wealthy people attending the gala, almost no one ever remembered such simple human details about the invisible staff. From his vantage point near the center of the massive main ballroom, David Osborne observed this entire beautiful interaction with an overwhelming sense of love and quiet pride. That rare, authentic way she treated absolutely every person she encountered, regardless of their social standing, was the primary reason he had fallen so deeply in love with Ivy exactly 2 years ago. David had never forcefully insisted on uncovering every single detail of his beloved wife's mysterious past, as she always repeated that she vastly preferred to be judged solely by her daily actions and not by whatever family surname happened to be printed on her birth certificate. He walked over to her side gently, intertwining his fingers with hers softly, asking how she was holding up amidst the overwhelming crowd. To which she replied she was fine but felt the evening would be exceptionally long. David offered a tired, knowing smile, explaining that his ambitious father had been living and breathing exclusively for this particular gala for weeks, firmly believing that the entire future of their massive enterprise could be decided tonight. Ivy immediately understood the heavy implication. For several consecutive weeks, the national financial press had been obsessively discussing a massive, multi-billion-dollar sustainable urban development project that Anderson Capital Group was planning to launch along the beautiful California coastline. Securing that monumental government-backed contract would unequivocally represent a historic turning point for any major construction company in the country, guaranteeing unprecedented wealth and decades of absolute industry dominance. The name of the elusive billionaire Alexander Anderson echoed constantly among the small, excited circles of gossiping guests, though many wildly speculated about whether he would actually show up. People fervently whispered that the reclusive tycoon essentially never accepted public invitations, absolutely refused to publish recent photographs of himself in the media, and deliberately ignored desperate executives who had spent countless years unsuccessfully trying to arrange even a brief 5-minute meeting. Ivy quietly listened to these escalating, breathless rumors while calmly holding a simple glass of sparkling water, offering no outward reaction to the intense speculation swirling around her. Suddenly, her cell phone vibrated very discreetly inside her small clutch purse, prompting her to swiftly read a surprisingly brief text message, smile, faintly, for just a fleeting fraction of a second, and silently tuck the device away, without uttering a single word. Only a few yards away, the formidable patriarch Edward Osborne was busy holding court, aggressively conversing with several immensely wealthy private investors. Even at his advanced age, Edward constantly projected the intimidating, unyielding confidence of a powerful man thoroughly accustomed to making ruthless corporate decisions, having brutally built his massive empire entirely from scratch. However, the bitter, lingering memory of a terribly impoverished childhood continuously haunted him, clinging to his soul like a heavy, suffocating shadow that he could never quite manage to completely leave behind, no matter how much money he aggressively accumulated. When Edward finally lifted his cold gaze across the room, his eyes instantly locked onto Ivy, a woman he had absolutely never accepted into his elite family, because her total lack of a verifiable, prestigious background made him deeply, irremediably suspicious. In his harsh, cynical life experience, anyone who deliberately obscured their personal origins was almost inevitably attempting to hide a fatal weakness, a dangerous financial liability, or a shameful secret that could potentially damage his pristine corporate reputation. Catherine Osborne, his fiercely elitist wife, slowly sauntered up beside him, dramatically swirling her expensive wine, and whispering venomously about how Ivy was once again socializing with the hired help instead of networking with their vital, high-net-worth investors. Edward remained completely silent, his jaw tightly clenched, as he watched several prominent businessmen cordially greet Ivy, entirely unaware of her incredibly modest origins, a sight that actively fueled a dark, burning sensation of profound mistrust in his chest. Taking a very slow, deep breath to steady his rising temper, the powerful patriarch decisively placed his crystal glass onto a passing waiter's tray and began marching with terrifying, deliberate purpose straight toward the exact center of the crowded ballroom. As he aggressively approached, the surrounding conversations naturally began to quietly die down, creating an eerie wave of silence that made David's stomach knot with a sudden intense feeling of impending dread. Ivy also noticed the intimidating older man aggressively closing the distance, prompting her to take a deep, steadying breath, briefly tightening her nervous grip on her small shoulder bag before forcefully straightening her spine and mentally preparing herself for the inevitable confrontation. She managed to completely recover her outward composure, holding her hostile father-in-law's piercing glare with a profound, quiet serenity that was born entirely from deep personal conviction, not from foolish, unearned arrogance. Stopping directly in front of Ivy, Edward Osborne radiated the overwhelming, demanding authority of someone who had spent their entire adult life brutally directing massive corporations and mercilessly bending thousands of employees to his absolute will. The lingering background chatter completely evaporated into a heavy, uncomfortable silence, prompting some nosy guests to subtly raise their mobile phones to record the unfolding drama. Sensing that something explosive was about to publicly transpire, Ivy maintained a remarkably polite, remarkably contained smile, softly suggesting that perhaps tonight, given the joyous occasion, the family could finally celebrate together without the heavy burden of constant underlying interrogations regarding her personal history. David immediately stepped forward protectively, positioning himself slightly in front of his wife, urgently whispering to his father that this highly public, festive environment was absolutely not the appropriate time or place to have this deeply personal, aggressive discussion. Edward coldly countered that this was precisely the exact right place, keeping his icy, unblinking gaze firmly locked on his daughter-in-law, loudly declaring that 2 entire years had passed since their wedding, and the family still knew absolutely nothing about her true origins. He aggressively pointed out that such persistent, deliberate silences always breed dangerous questions, suggesting loudly enough for the closest investors to hear that she must be hiding a severely damaging secret that could potentially humiliate the esteemed Osborne legacy. Ivy responded with absolute unwavering calm, stating quietly but firmly that her humble family had simply never actively sought out public attention, wealth, or high society validation, preferring to live their quiet lives entirely in peace. Catherine Osborne let out a sharp, incredibly theatrical sneer, dramatically mocking Ivy's measured response by loudly calling it suspiciously convenient that her mysterious family was supposedly just too discreet to ever show their faces at a major life event. David squeezed his wife's trembling hand angrily, demanding that his hostile parents stop this unprovoked public attack immediately. But Edward stubbornly pressed on loudly, lecturing the silent room that trust within a powerful dynasty must be strictly built on total financial transparency. An anxious, well-meaning investor nervously attempted to completely change the painfully awkward subject by enthusiastically mentioning the massive Mediterranean-style urban project on the coast. But Edward aggressively cut him off with a sharp, dismissive wave of his hand. Edward demanded the room's attention, launching into a bitter, impassioned speech about how he was only 17 years old when he realized the world gives you absolutely nothing, explaining that he survived a brutal neighborhood where every single day was a desperate fight. He passionately proclaimed that he had sworn a solemn oath that his privileged children would never experience that agonizing poverty, justifying his cruel, demanding nature as the necessary armor required to fiercely protect the incredible empire he had bled to construct. David looked at his stubborn father with profound, agonizing sadness, acutely realizing that all of these harsh, defensive words merely hid the pathetic, lingering terror of a broken man who had never truly managed to escape the ghosts of his own impoverished youth. He quietly but firmly reminded his father that Ivy had never once asked the wealthy family for a single penny, a statement that Edward immediately dismissed, coldly, retorting that he was entirely concerned with verified trust, not petty cash. Edward dramatically offered his son one final devastating ultimatum, giving him the immediate choice to publicly end this highly suspicious marriage right now and retain his rightful place as the sole heir to the massive Osborne Holdings empire, or lose everything. David did not hesitate for even a single fraction of a second. He boldly raised Ivy's hand completely, intertwining his fingers with hers for everyone in the room to clearly see, and confidently announced to the entire silent ballroom that he unequivocally chose his wife. A collective gasp of sheer disbelief violently rippled through the massive ballroom, while Catherine's eyes widened in utter shock, and Edward remained frozen, processing the total rejection, before coldly whispering that his son was officially stripped of all future family inheritance. David firmly held Ivy's hand, fully prepared to proudly walk out of the toxic environment forever, when Catherine suddenly gasped violently, clutching her chest in a terrifying display of sheer, unadulterated panic that completely froze the departing couple in their tracks. Catherine frantically began tearing through her expensive designer shawl and rummaging wildly inside her heavily beaded clutch, her breathing accelerating into a full theatrical panic attack as she loudly screeched that her beloved grandmother's priceless vintage diamond brooch was missing. For several agonizingly long seconds, absolutely nobody dared to utter a single sound, until Catherine slowly raised her furious eyes, her gaze locking directly onto the very simple, inexpensive shoulder bag resting tightly against Ivy's side. With absolute venomous certainty, Catherine dramatically pointed an accusatory finger directly at her daughter-in-law, screaming hysterically that Ivy had been standing right next to her just a few minutes prior, and that there was simply no other logical explanation for the devastating theft. Every single pair of eyes in the massive opulent room instantly snapped toward Ivy, who stood completely paralyzed by the horrific accusation. Though she could acutely feel her own heart begin to violently hammer against her ribs in sheer overwhelming panic, she instinctively pulled her small purse tighter against her body, desperately attempting to conceal the subtle, uncontrollable trembling of her hands, as Catherine took a deeply aggressive step forward, loudly repeating to the stunned crowd that she was entirely certain of the theft. The surrounding guests immediately began heavily exchanging incredibly uncomfortable, highly suspicious glances, while loud, toxic whispers aggressively circulated through the dense crowd, forcing an already tense Edward to let out a deep, frustrated sigh before loudly calling out for Michael, the burly head of corporate security. Michael materialized almost instantly, his face a perfect mask of professional neutrality, as Edward coldly ordered him to immediately escort Ivy into the private soundproof executive study to quietly but thoroughly resolve this highly embarrassing criminal matter away from the prying eyes of the press. Michael hesitated for a very long moment, respectfully suggesting to the powerful patriarch that they should absolutely search the surrounding floors and the rest of the massive mansion first, but Edward aggressively shut him down, demanding that he rule out the prime suspect immediately. David furiously stepped in front of his terrified wife, aggressively challenging his father's blatant cruelty and loudly questioning how he could possibly subject a completely innocent woman to such a degrading, humiliating criminal search in front of hundreds of people. Edward maintained his incredibly icy demeanor, flatly stating that he was not officially accusing anyone of a crime without first thoroughly checking the hard facts, insisting that this highly sensitive conversation would absolutely continue behind perfectly closed doors. A very small, intensely awkward group consisting of Catherine, David, Michael, and two highly respected senior board members escorted Edward and a deeply shaken Ivy into the small, heavily wood-paneled executive study where the heavy oak door clicked shut, creating a suffocatingly silent atmosphere. Michael took a very deep, highly uncomfortable breath, looking at Ivy with genuine, profound pity, before very respectfully asking for her explicit, voluntary permission to thoroughly physically search the contents of her small shoulder bag. David immediately and furiously shook his head, passionately telling his beloved wife that she absolutely did not have to accept this highly illegal, deeply degrading demand. But Ivy looked at him with immense, heartbreaking tenderness, knowing exactly what she had to do. With a voice that violently shook with barely suppressed, deeply painful emotion, she quietly explained that if she forcefully refused the search, the toxic, destroying suspicions of this powerful family would absolutely never end, and she slowly, carefully handed over her purse. Michael placed the small, inexpensive bag onto the massive mahogany desk and proceeded to physically inspect every single zippered compartment with extreme, highly professional care, fully expecting to uncover the stolen, priceless diamond family heirloom. However, he only pulled out a very simple leather wallet, a remarkably standard cellular phone, a small set of house keys, a tiny paper notebook, and a basic pair of reading glasses, officially confirming that there was absolutely nothing else hidden inside. The visibly relieved head of security looked directly into Edward's deeply skeptical eyes, clearly and professionally announcing to the entire tense room that the missing vintage diamond brooch was absolutely not located anywhere within the young woman's personal belongings. David let out a massive, deeply shaky breath of profound relief, but an incredibly stubborn Catherine continued to fiercely pace the room. frantically insisting to anyone who would listen that the extremely valuable piece of jewelry absolutely had to be somewhere nearby. Edward remained standing completely still, his face an unreadable mask of total stone. For several agonizingly long moments, he genuinely seemed to internally debate whether to actually accept his daughter-in-law's proven innocence or stubbornly continue pushing his utterly baseless, cruel paranoia. Finally, he coldly broke the heavy silence cryptically, and cruelly stating that outward appearances can be highly deceiving, and that sometimes wealthy families know perilously little about the true, dark, manipulative nature of the deceptive people standing right in front of them. Those incredibly cruel, totally unforgiving words actively hurt Ivy significantly more than the highly degrading physical inspection itself. She felt a massive choking knot form deep within her throat, fully realizing that for these elitist people, her deep, genuine love would simply never be enough. It was not a feeling of violent, explosive rage, but rather a deeply bitter, profoundly melancholic realization that her complete honesty and unwavering devotion over the past 2 years were considered totally worthless in the eyes of this aggressively arrogant, deeply broken family. Despite the crushing emotional weight of the completely unprovoked humiliation, Ivy proudly lifted her chin softly, but firmly, telling the cruel patriarch that she sincerely and deeply regretted that he held such a dark, twisted, and totally unfair opinion of her character. Before Edward could utter another harsh response, an incredibly furious David aggressively turned toward the head of security, forcefully demanding that Michael immediately pull and review every single frame of the mansion's high-definition security footage to completely and officially clear his wife's tarnished name. Michael nodded without a single moment of hesitation, fully prepared to march down to the heavily guarded basement control room when he suddenly received an incredibly urgent, highly unexpected transmission directly through his discreet high-tech security earpiece. The burly man listened in absolute stunned silence for several seconds, his professional facial expression transforming instantly into a look of total, undeniable shock before he looked up and loudly announced that the frantic mansion staff had just officially located the missing vintage brooch. Exactly 1 minute later, the highly embarrassed senior butler nervously entered the private executive study, carefully carrying a very small, luxurious velvet box, quietly explaining that Madame Catherine had carelessly removed the diamond piece while changing her designer shawl earlier that evening. The apologetic servant explained that she had simply abandoned the priceless heirloom carelessly upon her upstairs bedroom vanity, prompting him to securely lock it inside the velvet box to completely prevent the exact type of unfortunate loss she had just hysterically claimed. The butler slowly, dramatically opened the tiny lid, fully revealing the gorgeous, entirely undamaged vintage diamond brooch resting peacefully on the soft cushion. An incredibly heavy, profoundly humiliating silence crashed over the room as Catherine's heavily powdered face completely lost all of its color. The two senior corporate board members exchanged incredibly awkward, highly disgusted glances, while David tightly grabbed Ivy's trembling hand, fiercely glaring at his incredibly stubborn father, fully expecting the powerful patriarch to immediately issue the massive, groveling apology that the innocent woman so clearly deserved. Edward stared intensely at the sparkling diamond jewelry for several long, deeply uncomfortable seconds, acutely aware that he desperately needed to officially apologize, but his massive, deeply ingrained toxic pride aggressively overpowered his basic human decency. He finally spoke, his voice completely devoid of any genuine warmth, coldly stating that while she might not have actually committed a literal crime tonight, he firmly and completely believed that a woman of her invisible status would simply never truly belong in their elite world. Those incredibly harsh, totally unapologetic words profoundly disappointed absolutely everyone present, prompting one of the highly respected senior board members, a woman named Sarah, to slowly shake her head in total disgust and silently walked straight out of the room. At that precise, tense moment, Michael pressed his hand tightly against his security earpiece for a second time, listening to a frantic, breathless update from the main gate that actively drained the remaining color from his normally stoic, highly professional face. He locked his wide, utterly shocked eyes directly onto his demanding boss, his voice noticeably trembling as he officially announced that the incredibly powerful, highly elusive billionaire, chief executive officer of Anderson Capital Group, had just surprisingly arrived at the mansion's front gates. Michael paused for an agonizingly long second, swallowing hard before dropping the ultimate bombshell. The immensely powerful billionaire had aggressively bypassed all normal security protocols and explicitly specifically demanded to speak privately and immediately with the totally unassuming young woman named Ivy. The massive, heavy wooden doors of the grand ballroom slowly swung open completely, silencing the remaining gossip as a remarkably calm, incredibly distinguished man who appeared to be around 60 years old confidently crossed the marble threshold. He wore an absolutely immaculate, perfectly tailored, dark gray suit, accompanied by absolutely zero armed bodyguards or frantic personal assistants, commanding total absolute respect, not through flashy ostentation, but through a deeply natural, incredibly powerful aura of supreme authority. Edward immediately frowned in deep confusion, having desperately spent countless agonizing months aggressively begging for a highly coveted lucrative meeting with the legendary Alexander Anderson, yet he had never actually managed to catch a single fleeting glimpse of the powerful man in person. The highly distinguished newcomer slowly methodically swept his sharp, highly intelligent gaze across the completely silent room, immediately taking in the massive tension. The open velvet box resting on the desk, the guilty faces, and David bravely holding Ivy's hand. Alexander confidently walked straight toward the young couple, offering a surprisingly warm, deeply genuine smile as he casually apologized for his slight delay, casually mentioning that his private jet had unfortunately landed late in Los Angeles, and the heavy highway traffic had naturally done the rest. Ivy smiled back with an overwhelming sense of profound, emotional relief, softly replying that the only thing that truly mattered right now was the incredibly comforting fact that he had finally arrived to safely take her away from this toxic nightmare. Those deeply familiar, highly intimate words immediately sparked a massive wave of intense, desperate curiosity among the wealthy guests, prompting an incredibly eager Edward to quickly step forward, enthusiastically bowing and declaring what an absolute unparalleled honor it was to finally host the legendary investor. Alexander barely acknowledged the groveling patriarch, with a very slight, highly dismissive tilt of his head, coldly stating that he had quietly stood in the hallway and listened to significantly more of the cruel, degrading interrogation than anyone in the room could possibly imagine. An incredibly thick, deeply suffocating blanket of total silence violently smothered the entire ballroom as Edward nervously attempted to completely regain control of the rapidly deteriorating situation, pathetically stammering that the ugly incident had simply been a highly private, strictly internal family misunderstanding. Alexander completely ignored the frantic excuse, locking his warm, incredibly gentle eyes directly onto Ivy, softly asking if she was entirely unhurt, to which she managed a tiny nod, her totally exhausted eyes reflecting the heavy, painful toll of an incredibly brutal, unforgiving night. Finally turning his piercing, highly judgmental gaze back toward a sweating Edward Osborne, Alexander asked one incredibly simple, profoundly devastating question: if the stolen diamond brooch was absolutely never inside this innocent young woman's bag, why had nobody possessed the basic decency to apologize? Absolutely nobody dared to answer. Even the highly aggressive, usually vocal Catherine pathetically stared at the marble floor, utterly incapable of finding even a single ounce of courage to properly meet the intensely disappointed, deeply powerful gaze of the billionaire. Alexander spoke with a chilling absolute calm, explaining that in his many decades of highly successful corporate business, he had thoroughly learned that a simple financial mistake can always be corrected, but inflicting deeply cruel, completely unprovoked public humiliation leaves permanent, unforgivable psychological wounds. Edward desperately and pathetically attempted to forcefully justify his cruel actions, one last time, loudly insisting that his primary, overriding obligation as a powerful patriarch was to ruthlessly protect his highly valuable family and their massive, vulnerable corporate empire from outside threats. The legendary investor slowly stepped forward, heavily questioning exactly who Edward thought he was, protecting them from effectively leaving the highly embarrassing question hanging heavily in the tense, silent air, while Edward repeatedly opened his mouth but miserably failed to produce a single coherent response. Alexander confidently paced the floor, addressing the entire room of wealthy elites, openly declaring that before he ever invests millions of dollars into any major organization, he strictly observes exactly how that specific company blindly treats vulnerable people when they believe nobody important is watching. He emphatically stated that tonight he had clearly witnessed a beautiful, deeply humble young woman actively helping the invisible catering staff, listening with genuine respect, and bravely enduring a completely false, horrifyingly cruel public humiliation without ever once losing her profound inner grace. Then he looked directly at a stunned David, with a deeply approving nod, proudly adding that he had also witnessed an incredibly brave, highly honorable young man totally willing to completely sacrifice his entire massive fortune merely to fiercely protect the innocent woman he truly loved. Alexander reached out and gently, lovingly grasped Ivy's trembling hand deeply, inhaling the cool ocean air before officially announcing to the breathless crowd that the ridiculous, unnecessary time for total secrecy had officially come to an immediate and permanent end. He paused for dramatic effect, explicitly acknowledging that absolutely everyone in the wealthy elite California community had spent countless years desperately wondering exactly who the elusive, highly secretive founder of the massive Anderson Capital Group truly was behind closed doors. With absolute unwavering serenity, he officially introduced himself to the shocked crowd, pausing slightly, as a massive wave of sheer, unadulterated astonishment violently rocked the room before looking at Ivy with immense, totally overflowing parental pride. He loudly and clearly declared to the absolutely terrified Edward Osborne that the incredible, deeply humble woman they had all so viciously attacked and relentlessly doubted tonight was, in fact, his only beloved daughter and the sole future heir to his entire corporate empire. Multiple expensive crystal champagne glasses actually slipped from trembling hands, shattering loudly onto the marble floor, as senior corporate board members loudly gasped in pure horror, while a completely devastated Edward physically felt all the blood violently drain from his pale, sweating face. Alexander coldly explained that 2 entire years ago, his brilliant daughter had specifically chosen to build her own independent life completely without utilizing his massive wealth or famous surname, deeply hoping to find decent people who would truly value her beautiful heart. He locked his deeply furious, highly intimidating eyes directly with Edward's totally defeated gaze, heavily concluding that tonight he had tragically discovered that his daughter's beautiful, innocent hope was totally misplaced in this deeply arrogant, completely morally bankrupt environment. Reaching into his tailored jacket, Alexander slowly produced a thick, highly anticipated leather envelope containing the official, heavily contested contracts for the massive coastal development project, dramatically holding it up for the entire paralyzed room of greedy investors to clearly see. Without raising his powerful voice, the billionaire calmly announced that while the final corporate winner had not yet been fully decided, he could absolutely and officially guarantee that Osborne Holdings was permanently, irrevocably disqualified from ever participating in the highly lucrative bidding process. For the absolute first time in his entire brutal life, Edward completely realized that true lasting prestige never actually depended on the massive size of a bank account, but entirely upon how a person treated others when they believed there were zero financial consequences. The following morning, every single major financial newspaper in the United States prominently featured a highly shocking, extremely brief official statement, heavily released directly by the notoriously secretive Anderson Capital Group regarding their massive, highly anticipated California coastal project. The highly damaging press release officially confirmed that Osborne Holdings was completely permanently excluded from all future financial evaluations, boldly including a highly pointed statement declaring that basic human respect securely constitutes an absolutely essential, non-negotiable criterion in all of their corporate decisions. Those incredibly devastating, highly specific words instantly triggered massive, widespread panic among anxious Wall Street analysts, frightened corporate shareholders, and aggressive financial journalists, causing the company phones to ring relentlessly throughout the entire chaotic morning at the main Osborne headquarters. The highly alarmed corporate board of directors immediately convened a completely unprecedented, highly extraordinary emergency meeting where a desperate, sweating Edward arrogantly arrived, still fully convinced that his aggressive bullying tactics could somehow successfully defend his totally ruined, completely toxic management style. However, he tragically encountered an unusually silent, deeply hostile environment where absolutely nobody argued, nobody raised their voices, and the incredibly angry board members seemed to have already reached a completely unanimous, totally devastating conclusion long before he even walked into the room. Sarah, the highly respected senior board member who had previously walked out of his office in total disgust, firmly addressed him, explicitly stating that a massive, totally unforgivable loss of public credibility demanded immediate, highly severe corporate accountability to desperately protect their remaining clients. Following an incredibly brief, highly superficial deliberation, the furious board unanimously voted to officially immediately suspend Edward from his powerful executive leadership position, ordering a massive, completely independent external review of the incredibly toxic, completely broken ethical culture he had brutally fostered. When the totally broken patriarch slowly exited the massive glass building, absolutely no eager journalists actively requested his opinion. And for the absolute first time in 30 long years, he walked entirely alone, completely stripped of all his terrifying, carefully constructed corporate power. Exactly 6 months later, beautiful spring weather fully returned to the gorgeous coastal city of Santa Barbara, bringing massive crowds of happy tourists, energetic locals, and running children back to the warm, sun-drenched, picturesque beaches bordering the deep blue Pacific Ocean. Absolutely nothing had fundamentally changed regarding Ivy's wonderfully simple, deeply happy lifestyle. She still actively drove her old, reliable compact car, wore comfortable, unpretentious clothing, and cheerfully greeted her favorite local barista, a sweet girl named Chloe, by name every single weekend. David completely transformed his life after abandoning his toxic family legacy and asking his father-in-law Alexander for an entry-level job where he could earn respect through hard work. Alexander gladly gave him the opportunity, pairing him with a supportive colleague named Thomas, so he could build an honorable career from the ground up. One afternoon, Alexander admitted that he had once seen David as merely polite and quiet, but the events of that difficult night revealed him to be brave, loyal, and truly worthy of his beloved daughter. He reflected that while many people claim loyalty when life is easy, only a few remain faithful when genuine love demands sacrifice. At the same time, Edward Osborne lived alone in deep regret, repeatedly starting an apology letter to Ivy, but never finding the courage to finish it, finally realizing that the greatest mistake of his life was destroying the trust of his only son through pride and arrogance. On a peaceful Sunday